Peace Corps community, it's Andrea from Andrea Brene Abroad, and I have a tremendous number of updates for you all. The news has been moving extremely rapidly, and that is definitely the case for Peace Corps as well. Right now, the Peace Corps community has almost completed a global evacuation of all of its volunteers due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In this video, I'm going to be covering the newest letter written by Director of the Peace Corps. I'm going to be covering the FAQs that are perhaps the most important to PCVs. I'm also going to be covering the various news articles that have come out, namely by the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Chicago Tribune. And then finally, I'm going to give you all some resources for contacting your state legislators to support Peace Corps volunteers. So if you want to jump around this video, if one of those topics is of particular interest to you, I'm going to go ahead and have titles below down here for all of the sections. So if you just want to run your cursor across the timeline and find the information that you need, please feel free to do so. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the letter. I'm going to go ahead and read it for you all really quickly in case you haven't already read it yourself. I've also included a link down below if you'd rather read it on your own time. Totally fine. I'm just here to give you all the resources. As you know, given the dangers of the COVID outbreak and related travel constraints, we were forced to make difficult decisions to temporarily suspend all volunteer activities. Fortunately, we were able to safely evacuate each of our posts, avoiding a situation where volunteers would have been stranded overseas as borders and airspace were shutting down to prevent the spread of COVID-19. This was a tremendous undertaking, and it represents the very best of public service in a time of crisis. As with any crisis, however, myths emerge about the government's response. I'm writing to assure you that the Peace Corps is providing for the needs of the returning Peace Corps volunteers, including funds for travel, lodging, food, healthcare, medicine, and the products they need to stay healthy while traveling home during this emergency. In addition, the Peace Corps will provide evacuation and readjustment allowances, extended health insurance coverage, and lodging reimbursements for volunteers who are unable to self-quarantine at their home of record for the recommended 14-day quarantine period. The lodging reimbursement for self-quarantine is something the agency has never offered to volunteers before. Importantly, volunteers who evacuate will qualify for non-competitive eligibility, which makes it easier to join the federal workforce, and they will qualify for Coverdale Fellowship available to graduate students. Volunteers who seek to return to their host countries or seek a new assignment will be given expedited consideration over the next year. To be clear, the Peace Corps is not closing posts, and volunteers will be able to return to normal activities as soon as conditions permit. We are already planning for that day. For answers to many of the questions surrounding the return of volunteers to the U.S., please read the updates provided on this website. There's a link there so if you want to check it out. New content is being added to this page daily. We also encourage volunteers to access Learning Space over the course of the next year for detailed information on benefits, healthcare, returning to service, and ways to connect with the Peace Corps community. So I'm sure if you are a currently evacuated Peace Corps volunteer, your country director or other folks at your site have already informed you of this Learning Space, or at least I would hope so, but if not, there you have it. Having served as a volunteer in Tunisia, I have been part of that community for most of my life. The people of this agency are like family to me. The same goes for our volunteers and the more than 240,000 returned Peace Corps volunteers across the U.S. I will do everything I can to safeguard and celebrate the extraordinary group of Americans. The weeks and months ahead will not be easy, but the Peace Corps will continue to take action to support returning volunteers. Please take care. So that is the newest letter from Director Jody Olsen. I'm not sure if this is because the legislative efforts that were made or also the federal efforts that were made, but it is very clear that the Peace Corps community spoke up, both current evacuated Peace Corps volunteers as well as returned Peace Corps volunteers, to address the various needs of the volunteers, which I'll get to in a little bit later. Definitely I'm nodding my head to the different articles that have been published in recent days. It's very clear to me from this letter that the Peace Corps as well as the federal government was responsive to the pleas of the Peace Corps community. So that is really good news. So now I'm going to be discussing the FAQ page on the peacecorps.gov website. This has been live for a few days, but I haven't addressed it here on my channel, so I wanted to address a few of the points that stand out to me as an RPCV who served in Nicaragua seeing this list. Some of them are interesting, some of them I can definitely tell have been changed over the last few days, again in response to the different outcries that have been made by the Peace Corps community at large. The first thing that is important to know, and I think honestly most of the evacuation evacuees already know about this, but for our PCVs who maybe don't know this, all of the evacuated Peace Corps volunteers will be granted a close of service, a COS, on their formal DOS, their description of service, as they have been evacuated. That was a choice that was not up to them. Now, there's a few different caveats because we do have a few PCVs who were either medevaced or that they were on administrative hold. So I'm not sure exactly, but I know when I was evacuated from Nicaragua 2 years ago, I was on administrative hold for 2 months. So I'm guessing that may have been the case for some of the other countries, or that would not have been put on the FAQ. So their admin hold will be converted to COS status. Since it appears on the FAQ, it also looks like some folks opted to have an interrupted service to basically self-evacuate due to COVID-19. So I'm guessing some volunteers saw that the pandemic was really starting to ramp up and they made the choice to self-evacuate from Peace Corps. But back then they had to settle with an interrupted service. Now all interrupted service ISs are being converted to a formal COS with all the benefits. Really, the only folks who are not getting benefits are Peace Corps trainees. So the next FAQ section that I really want to draw everyone's attention to is the readjustment allowance. So the readjustment allowance is essentially what the Peace Corps provides you with when you move back to the United States, because the cost of moving back to the United States can be really expensive. You did also get a readjustment allowance when you first get to your site to just kind of accommodate there. I believe that's more around like $500. It's much less than your readjustment allowance. So what they are doing for this particular circumstance is if you served 24, so that's 2 years, 24 or less months, and this includes the trainees, you will receive 375 times the number of months served. If you served over 24 months, so if you extended your service, if you're a Peace Corps volunteer leader, or if you are a Peace Corps response volunteer, you will be receiving $475 times the number of months served. I do want to say that this is taxable. I know that sounds so unfair. I had to pay taxes when I was a volunteer, even though I only made $250 a month. It feels criminal. I wish that could change, but yes, it is taxable, unfortunately. Now, something that is entirely new, which I've never seen before, I know my group did not get this, is there's now an evacuation allowance. Let me go ahead and actually read this word for word because I want it to be crystal clear and I don't want to mess it up. The question is, what is the evacuation allowance and who is eligible? The evacuation allowance is provided for trainees and volunteers who had to close their service due to a country evacuation or suspension, and is intended to provide support to you as you return to the US on very little notice. Everyone who was in service as a Peace Corps trainee or volunteer when COVID-19 crisis required evacuation is eligible, including response volunteers and those on medevac, admin hold, or leave. The evacuation allowance is a separate allowance from the readjustment allowance and is in addition to the readjustment allowance you already earned. It is intended to replace the future readjustment allowance you would have earned in the next 12 months of service, but will not now earn due to the evacuation. This is the second part. How much evacuation allowance will I receive? So remember, this is in addition to readjustment allowance. The amount of evacuation allowance you will receive is based on two things. The first is the monthly accrual rate of your readjustment allowance on the date you COS due to the evacuation, as shown in the section on readjustment allowance. The second thing affecting your evacuation allowance is the time you had remaining in service. If you were scheduled to serve for 12 months or more beyond that date, you will receive 12 months of evacuation allowance. If you were scheduled to serve for less than 12 months beyond the COS date, you will receive evacuation allowance for the number of months you had scheduled to remain in service. So basically, if I'm not misinformed here, you get your full readjustment allowance as if you had completed service. You guys, that is an amazing deal. And yes, I am a little bit jealous because I did not get that when I was evacuated. And the last thing I want you all to know is that that evacuation allowance, as well as your readjustment allowance, will happen over the course of 3 payments. It's the same for people who are COS'd in a normal fashion. The other really important thing to know is that all of you, except for trainees, are eligible for the Coverdale Fellowship program and also the non-competitive eligibility for all federal jobs. So that's super great. I'm so glad that you guys are getting that benefit. The reason why this is so exciting is if you serve less than 12 months, you would not be eligible for this. That's what happened for most people. But since this was a global evacuation, you know, a lot of people had plans to go to graduate school after Peace Corps, and they were going to be relying on that Coverdale Fellowship or the non-competitive eligibility for getting a federal job. So, you know, this could have really messed with a lot of people's dreams, and I'm sure it still is for some of the trainees. I think the hope is that most of the trainees, you know, if you were genuinely committed to service, you had a good pre-service training, we're hoping that all of you trainees who were evacuated will reapply and you will be our first folks going back out into the field. I honestly think that's why they're doing that. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the articles. This is the third thing that I wanted to discuss in this video. So there have been three, I think, really important articles that have been published since the global evacuation of all volunteers began. The first is the Washington Post's article. It was a perspective piece and it's called "The Peace Corps Isn't Just Bringing Home 7,300 Volunteers Because of the Coronavirus, It's Firing Them." This article was written by columnist Joe Davidson, and I honestly think that this article, because it was circulated and shared so widely, I think by him having used the word or the phrase "it's firing them," referring to the Peace Corps, I think this honestly got the ball rolling for getting all of you that evacuation allowance, that readjustment allowance, the Coverdale Fellows program. I mean, so many things I think can be related to this article. I think this was huge. This was almost bigger than writing our legislators, honestly. I mean, this was, I think a lot of people were very upset by this article, and I think it also looked really bad for the Peace Corps. That's the first one. I did link that down below if you're interested in reading it. The second piece that I think was really important was the commentary written by Glenn Blumhorst for the Chicago Tribune, and it says, "The Peace Corps evacuated all 7,300 of its volunteers due to the coronavirus. They need help immediately." So kind of a call to action, I guess you could say. The first article that was published was really like, hey, a wake-up call in like a very like inflammatory kind of way, the firing word. This one, it's the call to action, right? It's asking everybody to help out. The final article was actually posted the day that I'm filming this, so I'm filming this on the 25th of March, and it is from the New York Times, and it's called "None of Us Saw It Ending This Way, Peace Corps Volunteers Evacuate Abruptly." This article was problematic for me for a few different reasons. I think the one at the forefront for me is it just felt kind of disrespectful for them to refer to the Peace Corps as the Corps throughout this article, and I know that a lot of people are unfamiliar with the different lingo within the organization, but you know, I just think for any sort of official position of service, right? Like we give the military so much respect, let's show the same amount of respect for our volunteers. It's called the Peace Corps. They also didn't capitalize volunteers. So just a few little minor things that I think really only returned Peace Corps volunteers would find offensive. But I will say I really approved of the quote that they pulled from the head of the National Peace Corps Association. They said, "We need to salute these individuals. They're the ambassadors of our country around the world and represent the best of America. They're coming home as heroes and we need to support them as a community and as a country." I absolutely love that from the president of the National Peace Corps Association, which is Glenn Blumhorst. So yes, I believe it is the exact same Glenn Blumhorst who wrote the Chicago Tribune piece. The last and final thing that I would like to share with you all is just encouraging you all to write your state legislators, please, your 2 senators, as well as your representative for your district. I already wrote to all 3 of mine, and I have attached below in the description box an example letter for the state of Oregon. So if you want to copy and paste it and quickly send it off to your representatives, of course, change it to match the name of your state, please go ahead and do that. I'll keep you all posted. I will have the part 2 of my evacuation story posting next Tuesday. I'm gonna try and get a video out to you every Tuesday and Thursday. Please be well, everyone. My heart is with all of you evacuated PCVs. Let's go ahead and stay in touch. See you all next week.